The year was 2347, and humanity had finally earned its place among the stars. But that place was not what they had hoped it would be, and Captain Daniel Hayes knew this better than most, as he stood in the grand chamber of the Galactic Council, watching. The ancient beings who ruled the galaxy dismiss humanity's dreams with barely a thought, and he had seen this coming for months. But knowing something would happen did not make it easier to accept when it finally arrived at your doorstep with all its terrible certainty, and the chamber itself was magnificent beyond description, stretching 300 meters in every direction, with holographic projections of 1,000 worlds floating in the darkness above like distant stars waiting to be claimed, but humanity would not be claiming any of them today or perhaps ever, if the council had its way, and that thought burned in Hayes's chest like a small sun, refusing to go out no matter how much cold logic he poured over it. And beside him stood Commander Lisa Grant, his tactical officer and closest friend on the ship, and she was trying very hard to keep her face neutral, but Hayes could see the anger building behind her eyes like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon, and he wanted to tell her it would be all right, but he could not lie to her. And so he said nothing and waited for the council to deliver their judgment like prisoners waiting for a sentence they knew would be harsh and unforgiving. The Vorthai ambassador spoke first, and his name was Jakrel, and he was a being made entirely of living crystal that refracted light in patterns that hurt human eyes to look at directly, and his voice came through translation devices that everyone wore like small insects clinging to their collars. And he said that humanity's petition to establish colonies in the Outer Rim territories had been reviewed and considered with great care, and after much deliberation the council had reached a decision, and that decision was no. And Hayes felt the word hit him like a physical blow, even though he had expected it, and Lisa's hand tightened on the datapad she was holding hard enough that Hayes heard the casing creak under the pressure. And Jakrel continued speaking as if he had not just crushed the hopes of billions of humans back on Earth, who were waiting for news of expansion and new worlds and fresh starts, and he explained that the council's decision was final and binding, and that humanity would not be permitted to expand beyond their current territories for the foreseeable future. And Hayes wanted to ask what foreseeable meant to beings who lived for thousands of years, but he kept his mouth shut and listened. A massive reptilian delegate from the Scarix Empire leaned forward, and his scales were the color of old bronze, and his eyes were like chips of yellow amber, and he spoke with a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. And he said that humanity expanded too quickly and too recklessly, and that in 30 years they had claimed 40 systems while the elder races had required centuries to achieve such growth. And this showed that humans lacked the wisdom and patience necessary for further territorial expansion, and they were aggressive and unpredictable, and the galaxy had seen species like this before. And those species had burned bright and fast, and then they had ignited wars that consumed entire sectors and left nothing but ash and radiation, and the council would not permit that to happen again. And Hayes listened to this and felt something cold settle in his stomach, because he realized they were not being judged on what humanity had done, but on what the council feared they might do, and fear was a terrible basis for justice, but it was apparently good enough for the beings who ruled the galaxy. The Eldari representative spoke next, and her name was Chelmora, and she was beautiful in a way that made humans uncomfortable, because her beauty was too perfect and too alien, and her skin glowed with soft light, and her voice sounded like music, played on instruments that had never existed on Earth. And she said that this was not about legality, because humanity had followed every protocol and honored every treaty, and no one disputed that, but it was about prudence and wisdom and protecting the galaxy from itself, and humanity reminded the council of species they had seen before, and those species had caused great suffering, and the council was older and wiser, and they were trying to guide humanity away from the mistakes that younger species always seemed to make. And Hayes wanted to scream that being guided felt a lot like being caged, but he kept his voice level and calm and asked if they would truly deny humanity the right to grow and expand, and Telemora looked at him with those luminous eyes and said they would guide humanity and teach them patience, and in 3 centuries, perhaps humanity would be ready for expansion. And 3 centuries was nothing to the Eldari, but it was everything to humans. And Hayes knew that this answer would not be accepted peacefully back on Earth. Lisa spoke up then, and Hayes knew she should not, but he understood why she could not stay silent. And she asked if the council would truly cage humanity like animals, and Jakrell's crystalline form flashed with patterns that the translator interpreted as patient condescension, and he said they would guide, not cage, and there was a difference even if humans could not see it yet. And Hayes looked around the chamber at the 1,000 species watching this exchange, and he saw fear in some faces and calculation in others and sympathy in almost none. And he understood then that the council was not unanimous in this decision, but they were presenting a united front because showing division would be weakness, and weakness was something the elder races could not afford to show. And Hayes made a note to remember that because it might be important later. And then he told the council that he would relay their decision to Earth Command, but he could not promise that humanity would accept it peacefully. And the Scarix delegate made a sound like rocks grinding together and said that humanity should understand the gravity of the situation and choose wisely because the council's patience had limits, and Hayes wanted to ask what would happen when that patience ran out. But he already knew the answer, and it involved fire and death and the end of humanity's brief journey to the stars. They returned to the Liberty's dawn in silence, and the ship was Hayes's command, and his home and the most powerful vessel humanity had ever built. But it was still just one ship against the thousands that the council could bring to bear if they decided humanity needed to be taught a lesson in humility. And Hayes stood on the bridge staring at the view screen, showing the Nexus station receding into the distance, and Lieutenant Commander Paul Fisher approached with a datapad containing an encrypted message from Earth Command, and Admiral Richard Bennett wanted Hayes's assessment of the situation. And the message contained only one question, and that question was whether humanity could fight the council if it became necessary. And Hayes thought about the combined fleets of the elder races and their thousands of ships and technologies refined over millions of years, and resources spanning entire galaxies. And then he thought about humanity's 200 warships and their stubborn refusal to be contained, and he asked Lisa what she thought, and she studied the tactical display for a long moment and then said that if it came to war, humanity would lose, but they would make the council remember them. And Hayes nodded, slowly, and sent his reply to Admiral Bennett recommending immediate diplomatic solutions and advising that military options were inadvisable but not impossible, and stating clearly that humanity would not accept containment under any circumstances. And he did not know then that his message would spark a chain of events that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization and force the council to see humanity not as children to be managed, but as equals to be respected, or at least feared. The Outer Rim territories beckoned like a promise waiting to be fulfilled, and they were empty and full of resources and perfect for human colonization. And humanity had never been good at accepting the word no when it came to exploration and expansion. And Hayes stood in the silence of the bridge and wondered what Earth Command would decide, and whether they would choose caution or courage. And he suspected he already knew the answer because humans were many things, but patient was rarely one of them. 3 months had passed since the Council delivered their ultimatum, and Earth's government had made their decision after countless debates and arguments that stretched through the halls of power like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. And they would not submit to containment no matter what threats the Council made, because humanity had not crawled up from the caves of Earth and built ships that could cross the stars just to be told where they could and could not go. And Admiral Richard Bennett sat in his office overlooking the lunar shipyards where humanity's fleet was being quietly reinforced with new weapons and stronger shields. And he had summoned Captain Daniel Hayes for a classified briefing that would change everything. And when Hayes arrived, Bennett did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk, and he simply said that they were going to call the Council's bluff, and Hayes studied the star chart projected between them, showing a route highlighted in blue that stretched toward the Outer Rim territories, and deliberately avoided all known Council patrol routes, and he understood immediately what Bennett was planning. Hayes said they were going to establish colonies anyway, despite the Council's prohibition, and Bennett nodded and explained that 12 ships would carry 6,000 colonists, along with essential supplies and terraforming equipment, and the colony convoy would be protected by 4 destroyers, and the Liberty's Dawn would lead them all. And Hayes said carefully that the Council would see this as an act of war, but Bennett corrected him and said the Council would see it as defiance. And there was a difference between the two, and he zoomed the display to show a specific star system called New Haven that was 3 weeks beyond the established boundary, and it was perfect for colonization with a Class M planet and abundant resources, and most importantly, it was nowhere near any Council territory, so humanity could claim with some legitimacy that they were not threatening anyone. And Hayes asked what would happen if the council intercepted them, and Bennett's face was grim when he said that Hayes would not fire first under any circumstances, but if the council fired on civilian transports, then Hayes had authorization to respond with necessary force, and the weight of that authorization settled on Hayes's shoulders like a physical burden. Commander Lisa Grant had been standing by the window looking out at Earth below, and she finally spoke and said that the council outnumbered humanity 100-1, and even if they won a single battle, they would lose any war that followed, and Bennett agreed, but explained that they were betting the council would not fire at all because the elder races maintained order through authority and tradition, rather than through military might, and they had not fought a real war in over 6 centuries, and Earth was gambling that the council had grown soft and their threats were hollow, and Hayes understood the calculation, but understanding did not make it less dangerous, and he knew that if they were wrong about this, then 6,000 civilians would pay the price for Earth's miscalculation. 2 weeks later, the convoy assembled at the jump point, and the colony ships were massive, ungainly vessels packed with dreamers and pioneers who believed in humanity's future among the stars, and Hayes watched them through the view screen as Lieutenant Paul Fisher coordinated departure sequences and made sure every ship was ready for the journey ahead, and Dr. Helen Carter requested a meeting on the bridge, and she was the expedition's chief scientist, and she had spent decades studying exoplanets and preparing for this moment, and when she arrived she thanked Hayes personally for making this mission possible, and Hayes said grimly that they should hope it did not get everyone killed. And Helen smiled and said her grandfather used to tell her about the old days on Earth, when there were still frontiers to explore and oceans to cross without asking permission from anyone, and humanity had always been at its best when pushing boundaries, and the council did not understand that about humans, and they thought containment would make humanity safe, but it would only make them dangerous, and Hayes thought about her words long after she left the bridge. The convoy jumped 3 days later, leaving council space behind and entering the vast emptiness between civilizations where no law existed except the laws of physics and survival, and for the first week, the journey was peaceful, and the stars had never seemed so welcoming or so full of promise, and Hayes began to hope that maybe they would reach New Haven without incident and establish the colony and force the council to accept the reality of human expansion. But on the 8th day, long range, sensors detected something, and Lisa studied her displays with growing concern and reported that they had multiple contacts and the configuration matched council patrol ships, and there were 6 vessels of Vorthai design, and they were 2 hours away at current speed and on an intercept course that would bring them face to face with the human convoy. Hayes ordered battle stations but kept all weapons locked, because firing first would make humanity the aggressor and give the council justification for whatever response they chose. And Paul opened a communication channel, and the Vorthai patrol commander appeared on the view screen, and his crystalline form was refracting light in patterns that the translator interpreted as agitation and anger, and he said that the human vessels were in violation of council space restrictions and must halt immediately and return to designated territories, and Hayes replied calmly that they were in unclaimed space beyond council jurisdiction, and humanity had as much right to be there as anyone else. And the Vorthai commander said that the council had decreed otherwise and the humans would comply or face consequences, and Lisa muttered under her breath, asking what consequences they meant and whether the council was really prepared to fire on civilian transports full of families and children. The tension stretched across light years as the two forces drifted toward confrontation, and neither side was willing to back down, and the Vorthai ships drew closer with their weapons powered, but not yet armed, and Hayes knew that the next few minutes would determine whether this mission ended in triumph or tragedy. And then he did something that no one expected, and he ordered all his ships to drop their shields, and Lisa looked at him in shock and started to protest. But Hayes cut her off and ordered Paul to open a channel on all frequencies that would broadcast to every ship in range, whether council or human, and when the channel opened, Hayes spoke clearly and carefully, choosing each word like a weapon. He identified himself as Captain Daniel Hayes of Earth, and explained that they were 6,000 civilians seeking a new home in unclaimed territory, and they carried no weapons of conquest, but only tools of survival, and if the great and ancient Council wished to fire upon unarmed colonists for the crime of dreaming. Then they should do so, but know that humanity would remember, and the galaxy would remember, and they would never ever forget. And the message went out across space, carrying with it the weight of humanity's defiance and desperation and hope. Silence filled the void between ships, and the Vortai vessels held position with their weapons still powered, but not firing, and seconds stretched into minutes. And Hayes watched the tactical display and wondered if he had just saved 6,000 lives or condemned them. And beside him, Lisa was barely breathing, and Paul's hands were shaking slightly as he monitored the communication channels, and everyone on the bridge was waiting for the universe to decide their fate. Finally, the Vortai commander spoke, and for the first time there was something other than authority in his crystalline voice, and that something was uncertainty and doubt. And he asked if humanity would truly risk everything for this. And Hayes replied simply that they already had, and the words hung in space between them like a challenge and a plea. The patrol ships withdrew, and Hayes knew they were reporting back to the Council, and this confrontation had merely delayed the inevitable, but they had crossed the boundary and made their statement. And as New Haven's sun appeared on long-range sensors, Dr. Helen Carter returned to the bridge with tears streaming down her face, and she said they had made it. And by all the gods of Earth, they had actually made it, and Hayes wanted to share her joy. But he was watching the tactical display, where more and more Council ships were beginning to converge on their position, like wolves gathering around wounded prey, and the real test was still ahead, waiting for them at New Haven, where humanity would either establish its first truly independent colony or face destruction at the hands of beings who had ruled the galaxy since before humans learned to make fire. New Haven was everything the scientists had promised, and more, with blue oceans that reminded the colonists of Earth, and an atmosphere they could breathe without filters, and rich soil that felt right under their hands when they touched it for the first time. And the colonists landed with joy and determination, and immediately began the work of building humanity's first truly independent world, beyond Council oversight. But Captain Daniel Hayes remained in orbit aboard the Liberty's Dawn, because he knew the Council would respond, and what he did not expect was the speed and scale of their reaction. On the third day after landing, 47 Council warships emerged from jump space and surrounded the planet in a blockade formation that was designed to contain and intimidate, and Commander Lisa Grant's tactical display lit up like a nightmare, with more targets than her systems could easily track, and she said they were completely outnumbered, and the Council could atomize both the Liberty's Dawn and the planet below if they chose to. And Hayes stared at the display and felt the weight of 6,000 lives depending on his next decisions. The Council's spokesperson this time was Ambassador Salamora of the Eldari, and her graceful features appeared on the view screen, but her musical voice carried a hard edge that Hayes had not heard before, and she said that Hayes had committed an act of unprecedented defiance, and the Council had convened an emergency session and reached a unanimous decision, and humanity had 48 hours to evacuate New Haven and return to Earth space, and failure to comply would result in the seizure of all human vessels and the arrest of all personnel involved in this illegal colonization. And Hayes asked what would happen to the civilians and what would become of 6,000 people who had done nothing but seek a better life among the stars. And Salamora paused before answering, and said they would be relocated to refugee processing centers until their final disposition was determined, and some might be allowed to return to Earth, but others might face penalties for their complicity in breaking Council law. Lieutenant Paul Fisher, who was normally calm and professional, spoke up angrily and said the colonists were farmers and teachers and families, and they were not criminals. But Chelmora replied coldly that they were violators of Council law, and this was not negotiable, and they had 48 hours. And then the transmission ended, leaving Hayes alone with his command staff and the terrible burden of deciding what to do next. Dr. Helen Carter was still on the surface coordinating the colony setup, and when Hayes contacted her, she was standing in a field of native grass that swayed in the alien wind, and she looked peaceful despite everything, and Hayes told her that the Council wanted them gone and everyone had to evacuate within 48 hours, and Helen looked around at the world she had dreamed of for decades, and asked what would happen if they refused, and Hayes said he could not protect them against 47 warships. And Helen was quiet for a long moment and then said they had a choice to make, and they could run back to their cage or stand for what they believed in. Over the next hours, Hayes watched something remarkable happen, and he had expected panic and anger and desperate pleas to save them. But instead the colonists held a vote, and they gathered in the main settlement square under New Haven's sun and debated their future like the democratic citizens they were. And the children were the deciding factor because they wanted to stay and build something here, even if it meant uncertainty and danger, and they did not want to return to Earth where they would be confined forever. And the vote was nearly unanimous, and they would not leave New Haven no matter what the council threatened. Hayes called Admiral Richard Bennett back on Earth, expecting orders to force the evacuation and save lives, even if it meant surrendering to the council. But Bennett surprised him and said that Earth Command had reviewed the situation and they were backing Hayes, and if the council wanted to remove those colonists, they would have to go through humanity's military first. And Hayes said that was insane because the council would destroy them, and Bennett agreed it was insane. But sometimes, insanity was the only sane response to injustice, and Earth was sending reinforcements, but they would not arrive for 3 weeks. And Hayes needed to hold his position until then, and Bennett's face was grim when he added that if shooting started, Hayes should make it count and make the council remember why humanity should never be underestimated. The deadline came and passed like a storm that everyone knew was coming, but hoped might veer away at the last moment. And Hayes positioned the Liberty's Dawn between the colony and the council fleet, with his 4 escort destroyers spread out in defensive formation, and it was a pitiful defense against the overwhelming force arrayed against them. But it was all humanity had, and sometimes all you had was enough if you refused to give up. Ambassador Selmora's voice crackled over the communication channel, and she said this was humanity's final warning and they must stand down, or the council would open fire. And Hayes looked at Lisa and at Paul, and at his crew who had never wavered, despite knowing they were outmatched and outgunned, and he thought of the families on the surface with children playing in alien grass, and pioneers building homes under unfamiliar stars, and he knew what he had to do. He said negative to Chelmora, and told her that humanity would not abandon these people. And if the council wished to harm civilians, it would have to destroy the Liberty's Dawn first, and for a long moment nothing happened, and the silence stretched across space like a rope pulled too tight, and then the council fleet began powering weapons, and Lisa's hands flew across her console as she reported multiple targeting locks, and the council was not bluffing anymore, and they were preparing to fire. Hayes opened a ship-wide channel and told his crew that they had known this might come, and whatever happened next, they should know they stood for something that mattered, and they stood for the right of humans to determine their own destiny, and it had been an honor serving with them, and he meant every word even though he knew they might be his last words as captain of the Liberty's Dawn. The first council ship moved forward, and it was a massive Scarix dreadnought easily 3 times the size of the Liberty's Dawn, with weapons arrays that glowed with gathering energy, and Hayes knew that one shot from that ship could punch through his shields and hull like they were made of paper, and Lisa was running calculations trying to find some tactical advantage that did not exist, and Paul was monitoring all channels hoping for a miracle that seemed impossible. And then something impossible actually happened. A new contact appeared on sensors, and it was not from the council fleet and not from Earth, and it came from deeper in the outer rim, from regions that no one had explored in living memory, and Commander Grant's voice was confused when she said she was reading something massive and bigger than anything in their databases, and the object materialized from jump space, and every sensor on the Liberty's Dawn screamed warnings that made no sense. It was a ship, but calling it a ship was like calling a supernova a flashlight, and it dwarfed the council dreadnought and dwarfed the entire combined fleet, and its hull was ancient and covered in symbols that predated any known civilization, and it just hung there in space, making everything else look small and insignificant. And then across every frequency and in every language simultaneously a voice spoke, and it was old beyond human comprehension, and carried the weight of eons. The voice said that the council would withdraw immediately, and there was no room for argument or negotiation in those words, and the Scarix dreadnought powered down its weapons instantly, and the entire council fleet began backing away from New Haven like children caught doing something wrong by a parent they feared, and Ambassador Kelmora's voice was shaking when she whispered that the architects were real, and Hayes stared at the impossible vessel and felt his understanding of the universe shift beneath him. The architects were a legend and a myth, and the supposed first civilization that had seeded the galaxy with technology billions of years ago, before vanishing into mysteries that no one could explain, and every child knew the stories, but no one believed they were real. And yet here one of their ships was hanging in space above New Haven, protecting humanity for reasons Hayes could not begin to guess. The ancient voice addressed Hayes directly and said that humanity had earned the right to be heard, and the Council would not interfere with this colony, and humans had the Architect's protection. And then, as mysteriously as it had arrived, the massive vessel disappeared and jumped away to unknown destinations, leaving behind only questions and confusion and wonder. The Council fleet departed within the hour, leaving New Haven in peace. But Hayes knew this was far from over, and they had been saved by a miracle they did not understand, and by beings whose motives remained completely unclear and on the surface. Colonists celebrated their impossible survival. But in the quiet of the Liberty's Dawn's bridge, Hayes and his crew faced a terrifying question that no one could answer, and that question was, what had they just unleashed upon the galaxy? 3 weeks passed in uneasy peace after the Architects intervened, and Earth's reinforcement fleet arrived at New Haven, transforming the single vulnerable colony into a fortified outpost with enough firepower to give any attacker pause. But Captain Daniel Hayes found no comfort in the additional ships and weapons, because the mystery of the Architects consumed his thoughts and kept him awake during the sleep cycles when he should have been resting, and he stood on the bridge of the Liberties, Dawn staring at sensor logs that showed the impossible ship appearing and disappearing like a ghost that defied all known laws of physics. Admiral Richard Bennett arrived aboard the command carrier Enterprise's Pride and immediately established a joint command center on the surface in a prefabricated building overlooking the growing colony settlement, and Hayes joined him there along with Commander Lisa Grant and Lieutenant Commander Paul Fisher. And Bennett looked exhausted when he said that Earth Command was demanding answers he did not have, and every government on Earth wanted to know why ancient alien gods had decided to save human colonists, and the scientific community was going insane trying to understand what they had witnessed, and the Council had gone completely silent, which terrified Bennett more than any threat, because silence meant they were planning something. Dr. Helen Carter entered the room carrying a datapad filled with xenoarchaeological data, and she had been working with minimal sleep since the Architect vessel's appearance, and her eyes were red but excited when she said she thought she knew why the Architects had intervened, and Hayes asked her to explain, and she projected a holographic timeline that showed the rise and fall of galactic civilizations across billions of years. Helen explained that every major civilization in the galaxy had legends about the Architects, and the Vortai called them the First Light, and the Scarix named them the Dawn Serpents, and the Eldari remembered them as the Singers of Stars, and there were 100 other names in 100 other languages, but there was a consistent pattern in all the myths, and that pattern was important. And Hayes asked what pattern she meant, and Helen switched the display to show comparative data from different species' historical records. She said the Architects appeared at turning points in galactic history, and they showed up at moments when civilization faced fundamental choices about its future, and according to every legend, they only appeared when the wrong choice would lead to catastrophe, and not just small disasters, but civilization-ending events that would reshape the galaxy. And Bennett leaned forward and asked if Helen was saying that humanity's confrontation with the Council was significant enough to wake up godlike aliens, and Helen nodded and said she was saying exactly that. Hayes walked to the window and looked out at colonist children playing in the settlement square, and he asked what choice the galaxy was facing that could be so important, and Helen explained that she had been analyzing communication patterns from the Council fleet during the standoff, and the data was encrypted, but the volume of transmissions suggested serious disagreement and massive debate happening across their ships. And Paul spoke up and asked if she thought the Council was divided about firing on humanity, and Helen said more than divided, and she thought they were on the verge of civil war. She explained that some Council members wanted to annihilate humanity as an example to other species who might consider defying the elder races, but others believed that would be genocidal overreach and a moral crime that would stain the Council forever. And the Architects did not just save humanity when they intervened, and they saved the Council from itself, and from making a choice that would have torn galactic civilization apart, and the implications settled over the room like a heavy blanket that pressed down on everyone. Hayes said quietly that humanity had forced a crisis that nearly shattered galactic civilization, and no wonder the Council had gone silent. And Helen said it got worse because she had been corresponding with xenoarchaeologists across human space, and there were ruins in the outer rim and ancient sites that predated any known civilization, and 3 of them had activated since the architect vessel appeared, and they were broadcasting signals that humans could not decode. But the pattern was clear, and something was waking up in the darkness beyond known space. Admiral Bennett stood and asked for recommendations, and his weathered face was grim, and Hayes said they needed to talk to the council, and not as subordinates asking permission, but as equals demanding answers, because the architects had chosen to intervene on humanity's behalf. But that did not mean humans understood why or what came next, and the council had been in this galaxy far longer than humanity, and they must know more about the architects than they had ever shared. The next day, Hayes received an unexpected transmission, and it was from Ambassador Selmora, but not through official council channels, and her holographic form appeared in his private quarters, and she looked diminished somehow and less certain than before, and she said she was contacting him without council authorization, and what she was about to share could cost her everything. But the stakes were too high for pride or politics. She explained that the architects had left the council a gift 2 billion years ago, and it was not technology or weapons but a warning, and there was a repository on the council homeworld of Eldara Prime in the deepest archives, and it contained a message left by the architects before they departed the galaxy, and the council elders had guarded it for millennia and shared its contents only with those who achieved the highest ranks of leadership. And Hayes asked what the message said, and Selmora's luminescent skin flickered with patterns of distress. She said the message warned that the galaxy would one day face a test, and a moment when the established order would be challenged by an ascending species, and how the established powers responded to that challenge would determine whether the galaxy survived or fell into darkness and chaos. And Hayes asked if she thought humanity was that species. And Selmora met his eyes through the holographic projection and said the architects appeared when the council was about to fire on human colonists, and they prevented that catastrophe, and they issued a command that had never been heard before in all recorded history, and they said that humanity had earned the right to be heard. Selmora continued and said that in all the billions of years since the architects departed, they had never declared any species worthy of protection until now, and until humanity and Hayes felt the weight of generations pressing down on him, and he asked what Selmora needed from humans, and she said she needed Hayes to come to the council, and not as petitioners but as equals, and bring Admiral Bennett and bring Dr. Carter, and they needed to convene the first truly galactic assembly, where every species had voice and not just the ancient ones. She explained that the architects had given the galaxy a chance to transform how civilization operated, but only if everyone had the courage to take it, and the old ways were failing, and the council's attempt to contain humanity had nearly triggered the exact catastrophe the architects warned about, and it was time for change, even if that change was frightening and uncomfortable. And Hayes listened to her words and understood that this was about more than human expansion and more than one colony on one planet, and this was about reshaping galactic civilization itself. The transmission ended, leaving Hayes alone with thoughts too large for one mind to hold, and he remembered Helen's words about the activated ruins and the waking signals spreading across the outer rim, and the architects had intervened, but not to end the story, and they had intervened to begin a new chapter, and that chapter's conclusion remained unwritten and unknown. Hayes contacted Admiral Bennett and Dr. Carter and told them they were going to the council homeworld, and this time humanity would change everything, and the Liberty's Dawn prepared for departure, carrying not just a crew, but the hopes of a species that had always refused to accept limitations. And ahead lay the council chambers where humanity would finally claim its voice among the stars. But in the darkness of the outer rim, ancient machinery continued to wake and count down to a convergence that even the architects might not be able to prevent. The journey to Eldara Prime took 12 days through established jump routes that had been used by countless species for millions of years, and Captain Daniel Hayes had never seen the council homeworld before, because few humans had ever been granted permission to visit. And as the Liberty's Dawn emerged from the final jump, the view screen revealed a sight that took his breath away and made him understand why the Eldari were considered the most artistically advanced species in the galaxy. Eldara Prime orbited a trinary star system with 3 suns of different colors painting the planet in constantly shifting light that created patterns no human artist could ever reproduce, and the world itself was covered in massive crystalline structures that grew from the continents like frozen music, and around it orbited 17 moons, and each moon had been carved into shapes that defied natural formation. And Dr. Helen Carter stood beside Hayes on the bridge and whispered that the Eldari had been building this for 4 million years, and every moon was a monument to some achievement or era. And this was not just a homeworld, but a living museum of galactic history. Admiral Richard Bennett, who had transferred to the Liberty's Dawn for the final approach, studied the orbital traffic and counted thousands of ships from hundreds of species all converging on the planet below. And he said that Ambassador Kilmora had not been exaggerating, and every species with council standing was sending representatives. And this was unprecedented in galactic history, and Commander Lisa Grant monitored the tactical situation with her usual vigilance, and noted that multiple capital ships were in close proximity, and if tensions escalated, this could become the worst battlefield in history. But Hayes said quietly, that was why it would not happen, because the architects had given everyone a wake-up call, and now they would see if the galaxy was ready to listen. They were escorted to the surface by an honor guard of Council security vessels, and the landing site was the Grand Amphitheater, which was a massive structure at Eldara Prime's equator, capable of holding representatives from every known species. And as Hayes stepped onto the crystalline surface, he felt the weight of history beneath his feet, and wondered how many momentous decisions had been made on this exact spot over the millennia. Ambassador Kilmora greeted them personally, and she was flanked by representatives from the other elder races, including the Vorthai's crystalline form and the Scarix's reptilian bulk, and species Hayes had only seen in databases, and they all gathered in an arc of greeting. And Kilmora said formally that Captain Hayes and Admiral Bennett and Dr. Carter were welcome to Eldara Prime, and by intervention of the architects, humanity had earned the right to address this assembly as equals, and what happened next would determine the future of galactic civilization. The amphitheater was overwhelming in its scale and grandeur, and thousands of beings from across the galaxy filled the space, and each species was gathered in designated sections, and Hayes and Bennett and Carter were escorted to a central platform that rose from the floor and positioned them at the focal point where everyone could see and judge them. And Hayes felt thousands of eyes upon him, and some were curious and some were hostile, and many were simply confused about why humans were being treated as equals. The Vorthai High Chancellor, whose name was Tormesh, opened the assembly, and his voice resonated through translation devices in patterns of crystalline harmony. And he said that for 8,000 years the Council had maintained order through hierarchy and tradition, and the elder races guided while the younger races followed, and this system had brought peace and prosperity to countless worlds. And then he paused, and his form refracted light in patterns of deep uncertainty, and he said that the architects had shown them this system stood at a crossroads. He continued and said that humanity had forced them to confront a question they had avoided for millennia, and that question was whether their peace was built on wisdom or merely on the threat of force. And murmurs rippled through the assembly, like waves across an ocean, and Hayes felt the weight of attention pressing down on him from every direction. The Scarix matriarch spoke next, and her scales gleamed like polished obsidian, and her voice rumbled like an earthquake, and she asked whether they should reward humanity's arrogance because the humans had defied the Council and rejected their guidance and claimed territory that had been forbidden. And Admiral Bennett stepped forward, and his voice carried the authority of decades of command, and he said that humanity did not defy the Council out of arrogance, but out of necessity. Bennett explained that humanity had been confined to a small pocket of space and forbidden to expand, while their population grew, and their resources diminished, and they sought only what any species needed, which was room to grow, and room to breathe, and room to become whatever they were capable of becoming. And the matriarch challenged him and asked if humans could not trust the Council's wisdom to guide that growth, and Bennett fired back and asked if the Council could trust its own wisdom. He said that every elder race in the chamber had enjoyed freedom to expand unchecked when they were young, and they had claimed hundreds of systems and made mistakes and learned lessons and grown strong through experience, but now they denied humanity that same opportunity. And not because humans had proven unworthy, but because the Council feared change, and the chamber erupted in heated discussion. And Hayes watched as species who had never questioned the established order began to argue among themselves. Dr. Helen Carter spoke, and her scientist voice cut through the chaos with calm clarity. and she asked if there were any paragraphs in the architect's warning that discussed ocean warming, and then she corrected herself and said she meant to ask about the warning itself, and Shelmora answered, and her musical voice was sad when she said the architects had not told them which species would be the test, and the council had debated for millennia about who it might be, and watched emerging species with paranoia and fear. Helen said that was because they were looking for conquerors and species that would challenge them militarily. But what if the test was never about military might? And what if the architects were asking a simpler question, which was whether the council would share power willingly or only when forced, and the truth of her words settled over the assembly like dawn breaking. And Hayes saw understanding spread across alien faces and tentacles and energy patterns and crystalline matrices. Hayes stepped forward, and when he spoke his voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the vast amphitheater, and he said that humanity did not come to demand anything but to offer something, and that something was partnership, and not between elders and children but between equals who each brought something valuable. And he gestured around him and said, humans were young and reckless perhaps, but they brought fresh perspectives and new solutions and the hunger to solve problems the old ways could not address. He looked around at the assembly and said the elder races brought wisdom and experience and technologies humans could barely comprehend, and together they could build something neither could achieve alone. And the Vorthai Chancellor approached. The human platform in his crystalline form glowed with inner light. And he said that Hayes was asking them to surrender thousands of years of tradition. And Hayes replied that he was asking them to evolve as they once did when they were young, and reaching for the stars. Hayes said the architects did not intervene to preserve the old order, but to give everyone a chance to create something better. And silence fell across the amphitheater, and then from an unexpected quarter, a voice spoke, and it was from one of the younger species called the Kalari, who were insectoid beings that had only achieved spaceflight 3 centuries prior, and their representative said through its translator that the humans spoke truth. The Kalari continued and said they too had felt the weight of council restrictions, and watched their potential limited by fear of disturbing ancient hierarchies. And if the architects declared humanity worthy, perhaps it was because humans represented not just themselves but all species who sought to grow beyond arbitrary limits, and other voices joined in, and species that had remained silent for centuries found courage to speak. And Hayes realized they had been waiting for someone to give voice to thoughts they had never dared express. The debate raged for hours, but slowly and inevitably consensus began to form, and the architects had forced a conversation that was 8,000 years overdue. And as the trinary sun set in spectacular chromatic displays, Ambassador Kelmora returned to the central platform and said the council would vote on a proposal that had never been considered in all their history, and they would vote to dissolve the Council of Elders and replace it with a truly representative assembly where every species had equal voice regardless of age or power. The vote took place the next day, and it was not unanimous because many elder races clung to their traditional authority. But it was enough, and by a margin of 63% galactic civilization chose transformation over stagnation. And as Hayes prepared to return to the Liberty's Dawn ambassador, Selamora approached him one final time and said he had changed everything, and for better or worse the galaxy would never be the same. And Hayes replied that the architects believed they were worth the risk, and now everyone had to prove them right.